Hello, everyone. I'm going to give it a few minutes to allow those who are coming in late to join. And so if you can hang in there for about another minute or so, and we'll get started. Okay, we are talking about sociological research, which is our second topic of the semester. We've spent a considerable amount of time talking about the origins of sociology and the theories that undergird the discipline. And the reason for that is that the social sciences in general and sociology in particular um, spend a significant amount of time investigating relationships in the social world, often having theory inform how they view and understand those relationships. And so at the core then of sociology is research, sociological investigation. And so I want to begin our conversation about this topic, one of those sort of foundational topics, whether you are a sociology major, psychology major, or engineer, you're going to have to do something involving research at the end of your by the end of your academic journey. So this is a good sort of introduction to this area of focus if you haven't already been introduced to it. So I'll just jump right in. Um, we start with the idea of science, truth. One of the things that we discussed on the first day of class was this idea of sociology being a science. And a part of what makes sociology science, as was stated then, and I'll reiterate now, is the idea that sociology goes about gathering information in a systematic way. The theories that we talked about, those theories were arrived at based upon systematic evidence research. But before we get into that, it's critical to frame the conversation. And so when we talk about science, which is about finding truth, a fact, we can ask the question, how do we know what we know? Um, Certainly science is one way of knowing things, but we recognize that there are other ways. And as a society, we did not always rely on science as a way of knowing. For much of human history, um, people relied on their faith, their beliefs. For example, few claim to have direct contact with God, but they say they believe all the same. And we'd say that we call this faith. And so we know that not only do many people believe in God, having never seen God, but they also go so far as to claim that God is a male, and they can describe God often from descriptions that were gathered from the Bible. And they believe, or we believe, that we know without any evidence, at least not any direct evidence, that a God exists. And so we call this knowing based on your belief, your faith. But we can also know things based on recognized experts. We know things because people who are considered experts in a given field tell us so. We listen to to meteorologists, for example, perhaps on a nightly basis, and they tell us what the weather is going to be, and we trust their um, their statements about what the weather is going to be the following day. We don't necessarily have to go back and do our own research, but we know things. We can know things because someone who is considered more knowledgeable in that field knows it, and we can base it on that. And so we know things, a lot of things based on what other people or experts have told us. We can also know things by simple agreement. We know that there's a lot of things that we take as fact, as truth, because a number of people have said those things to be true. Simple agreement. If a collective group agree on a certain fact, then we can accept that as fact based upon the numbers of people who say, and oftentimes it's people we trust, people who we believe have some credibility, but we don't necessarily know. It's not like we've done research to confirm the truth, but we know that because a lot of things, we just take it as a given. And certainly we can think of some things that are just considered common knowledge that we don't have empirical evidence to know that it's true, but we just accept it. And then there's science. Science is another way of knowing. Science is a logical system based on knowledge, on direct systematic observation. So thus, we know things because there's a logical system that have been put in place, and that logical system has produced a direct sort of systematic observation of something that we know to be true. And so in this particular regard, scientific knowledge rests on empirical evidence, information we can verify with our senses. So therefore we can see it, we can touch it, we can feel it, we can smell it, we can, we can kick it. We know that it exists because we can experience it. And so when we talk about things that we know based upon empirical evidence, it is things that we can directly observe, things that we can directly physically touch, things that we can pick up, things that we can smell. We know that it exists because we can experience it, and we can be much more comfortable in our sort of grounding that it is real because we can experience it. And we call that sort of empirical evidence. And by and large, scientific knowledge is based on that. Those are things that we can measure, things that we can observe, we can see. We can look out of the window and we know that it is snowing because we can see the snow. And so therefore we can be confident that that is truth. So empirical research involves data. There are two main types of data we can talk about: quantitative data or qualitative data. Quantitative data refers to data that involves the summary of information using numbers. So when we talk about statistical data, percentages, for example, those are quantitative data based on quantitative research. And so when we hear numbers like 74% of Americans believe that the economy is in good shape, that's a quantitative statistic. It's a quantitative measure of how Americans feel about the economy. There's numerical information is used to explain some social phenomenon. It's quantitative data. On the other hand, qualitative data relies more on experience, observation, non-data, non-numerical findings. And so we can say that, ask the question of how do Americans feel about the economy? And we can say something to the effect that 94, 92% of the people believe this or believe that. That would be a more quantitative analysis. Or a more quantitative approach would raise the question of how do Americans feel about the economy? It's one thing to know that um, there's a low percentage there's a low percentage of unemployment out there, that most Americans who want a job can get a job. But how do people feel about the economy? Do they feel like they are making gains in our economy? Do they feel like they are they can purchase a home and be comfortable with their making their monthly financial obligations? That's a different kind of measure. And so when we talk about qualitative data, it's non-empirical. I mean, not non-empirical, I'm sorry. It's non-numerical, and it is based on people's experiences, people's feelings. It's more of a description of how people feel, whereas quantitative data is more number driven. And so those are two ways in which empirical information can be presented. Both are empirical, just different forms. And so the scientific sociology then is the study of society based on systematic observation of social behavior. And with that, we start all research projects with a concept. A concept. A concept is a mental construct that represents some part of the world in a simplified form. There are concepts all around us. Poverty, for example, is a concept. Homelessness is a concept. Success is a concept. Those are all things that imply sort of mental constructs that represent something in the world in a simplified form. So when we talk about success, we have some idea of what success is. We talk about poverty, we have some idea, competition, democracy, all those things are constructs. But in order to investigate a construct, we often have to reduce it to a variable. And we know that not all concepts lend themselves to a form of a variable. And so that said, when we talk about investigating the social world, we know that there are a lot of interesting concepts out there that are worthy of study, but we know that it's very difficult to measure some concepts, and we'll get into that shortly. But when we talk about a variable then, a variable is a concept whose value changes from case to case. So if we talk about a concept of violence, for example, violence is a concept. Violence can go up, violence can go down. Violence can be intense, or violence can be less intense, or it can be moderate. And so there are all several ways in which violence can vary. And so that concept of violence can change from case to case. And by that, meaning that we can talk about violence going up, violence going down, violence being intense, violence being moderate. We can talk about all different types of violence. We can talk about violence in sports. We can talk about violence in war. And so violence as a concept can vary across different ranges. In a similar regard, we can talk about success in the same way. Success is a concept. You can have more success or less success. In that particular case, success as a concept, it changes from case to case. It can change from high to low, moderate to none. And so we can recognize that success as a concept, like many other concepts, changes. And so you want to be able to not only identify a concept, but you also want to be able to identify how that concept changes or can change. And so if a concept varies or can vary, then we should be able to measure that concept. And the way that we measure the concept is we measure the variance, the extent to which it changes. So a measurement is a procedure for determining the value of a variable in a specific case. And so in the case of violence, we can actually measure the concept of violence. We can look at how much violence there have been, and we can sort of cut it all at a particular time frame, how much violence in a given week have occurred, and that violence can range from high to low. And so it can vary from high amounts of violence to low amounts of violence. And we can measure that. We can assign a numerical number that will denote what is high violence, and likewise what constitutes low violence. And so that's how we measure that particular concept. We can measure income. Income is a concept that varies from high income to low income. And if we want to measure income, we have to identify a metric. How are we going to measure it? We can measure it in dollars. And so we can count in dollar amount, dollar increments, high income, and we can count in dollar increments, low income. Some people make, $100,000. Some people make $25,000, and we can measure that because it varies from dollar amount to dollar amount. And so that's what we mean by those three terms. We start with a concept, we consider how it varies, and then we think about how we measure that variance. When we talk about concepts and measuring concepts, we do this, at least scientifically, to establish cause and effect relationships. The idea that a relationship in which a change in one variable cause a change in another, we can say that those two variables are related if such an instance were to occur, where one variable is believed to cause a change in another variable. But when we talk about the social sciences, as we'll discuss later, social science, and so in the social sciences, rarely do we talk about cause and effect relationships, because a cause and effect relationship implies that one relationship is causing another relationship. And by causing, meaning that there's some sense of permanency, consistency, that it implies a law of change. And by law, meaning that there's a structured relationship between those two variables. And this is important because when we talk about the social sciences, because we are studying people, we are studying societies, we can never or very rarely talk about cause and effect. We can talk about correlations, but we can't necessarily talk about cause and effect, in that we can say one variable is correlated with another variable, but we can't necessarily say that one variable caused another variable. And so to give you an example, there is often talk about the relationship, for example, between poverty and violence, that impoverished neighborhoods are often violent neighborhoods. And while we might see that scenario played out in real life, we can't say that poverty causes violence, because to say that poverty causes violence, that would mean that all individuals who experience poverty are violent, when in fact, most people who are impoverished are not violent people. We know that data has shown that, research has proven that. And so we know that there are a lot of people who are poor that are violent. There are a lot of people who are poor that are not violent. There are a lot of rich individuals or wealthy individuals who are violent. And there are a lot of people who are not so wealthy that are not violent. And so we have to keep in mind that we can say that poverty is correlated with violence, but we can't necessarily say that it causes violence. And by saying correlation, it allows us to recognize that, to not be so deterministic in our language, to recognize that there are some people who are in certain situations that are violent, and there's other people who are not. We can talk about a lot of other things. We know that education is often said to be related to income, in that the more education you have, the higher your income. Again, we can say that education is correlated with income, but we can't say that getting an education that you will by all means deterministically earn a higher income, because we know that there are a lot of other variables at play to explain one's high income. Education is just one variable. So like many things in the social world, it's much more complicated than a cause and effect relationship. That said, when we talk about the relationship between one variable and another, we identify those variables as independent variables and dependent variables. These are things that you may have been exposed to in other classes or in high school, perhaps biology or physics. When we talk about an independent and a dependent variable, what we're saying is that a change in one variable causes or is correlated with a change in another variable. And so a change in the independent variable often leads to a change in the dependent variable. Put differently, the effects of the dependent variable is based on the independent variable, the effects of the independent variable. So a change in one leads to a change in the other. And so oftentimes the shift in the independent variable is dependent on change in the dependent variable. So in our example with education and income, we see that as education increases, being the independent variable, income also increases in the dependent. So your income is dependent upon your education is one way of thinking about that. So these variables are said to change together in a cause and effect relationship. But again, in the social sciences, we stay away from the language of cause and effect. We talk about correlations. Okay. A correlation, the relationship between two or more variables, implies a change in one leads to or is more likely to produce a change in another. It's less deterministic. It gives room for the complexity of the social world. Then, then there's a control variable. So in addition to our independent and dependent variable, social sciences often recognize that a third variable, what we call a control variable. A control variable is a variable that's often considered to be more important in the relationship. So if we talk about the relationship between violence and poverty, for example, it is often, as I said, spoken loosely that poverty leads to violence. Well, we can imagine a third variable in that connection, in that association. And so even though we can often see that violent communities are often more dangerous or violent than non-impoverished communities, we can also see that within those communities that the people who are doing the lion's share of the violence are males versus females. And so we can't necessarily say with a blanket statement that poverty leads to violence, because we know that the data also point out that men are more likely to commit acts of violence than women. And so if we remove then poverty, would that relationship still holds up, in that we can explain violence based on poverty, but we can also explain violence based on gender, in that men are more likely to commit acts of violence than women. The question for us then is, which one of those are more important to explaining violence? Is poverty more important, or is gender more important? Or combined, are they important? And so that gender relationship represents that third variable. We can throw a number of variables in there. We know that young people are more likely to commit acts of violence than older people. And so the question becomes, are young people, irrespective of their economic situation, more likely to commit acts of violence? And certainly the data point out that that is relatively true, that wealthy, middle-class, young people tend to be more violent than wealthy, middle-class, older people. And so we have to consider the impact of that third variable, or we call it a control variable. And so this comes into play when we are sort of investigating the conclusions, largely, of a research project. When we consider the conclusions, we want to know, yes, we want to know if our independent variable was in fact impactful on our dependent variable. But we also want to know about the consideration of those control variables. Because if we control for something and we find that the relationship remains, and that if we sort of consider the effects of gender on the relationship between poverty and violence, and we see that, for example, that there were no difference between men and women in terms of their violence, then we can be more confident that the relationship between poverty and income, or poverty and violence, is a real relationship and is not influenced by a third variable such as gender. We can become more confident in our results. And so in that particular case, that would be a direct relationship, when the initial relationship between your independent and dependent variable is reproduced, replicated, even when we control for a third variable. And so that's what we mean by direct relationships. Or when we can talk about spiritual relationship, but that's really beyond the scope of the class. And so I'm not going to go into that right now. But just to, for your own exposure, the spiritual relationship is what we've been talking about in terms of a control variable. That's an apparent or false relationship between two or more variables that is caused by some other variable. And so in the case of our example, gender or age would be that third variable, and poverty would be that sort of false relationship, because the relationship is not between poverty and violence. The relationship is between gender and violence, or age and violence. And so that would be a spurious relationship, the relationship between poverty and violence. So when we talk about scientific research, what sets scientific research apart from other ways of knowing, and one of the reasons why we can be more confident in the truthfulness and accuracy of information that's based on empirical observation or scientific inquiry, is the issue of objectivity, that the persons conducting the research are neutral in conducting that research. They're not allowing their biases to influence the outcomes or the design of the research. They're not allowing their biases to inform what they find. And so we talk about objectivity. We're saying that the person conducting the research is completely neutral in conducting the research. They have no persuasion of what they hope to find. They're just going on the evidence and what the evidence bring back. And so this means that specifically that the researcher has carefully considered the procedures, and they're not allowing their own attitudes and biases to influence the results. Sociologically, however, we know that complete subjectivity is an ideal rather than reality. Because we know that even the subjects that scientists decide to study is often informed by their personal attitudes, beliefs, and experiences. So it's only fitting then that you are going to study what you're passionate about. And oftentimes what you're passionate about that informs your research, it often has much to do with something that you have experienced. And so if, for example, you grew up in a community where there were a lot of bridges, then having crossed bridges or experienced bridges, seen bridges for an extended period of your life, you're more likely to venture into engineering because perhaps your interest was in building bridges, but that interest is subjective, it's personal. And you're able to take those personal feelings that you have for bridges and channel that energy into your research. And so we see that your interest is subjective. Now, you may go about designing, constructing bridges in an objective way, but we can't ignore the reality that your initial interest in bridges engineering was informed by a personal experience. And so therefore, let's give you one example of why sociologists, social scientists point out that objectivity is an idea rather than a reality. And we know that Max Weber was a strong component of objectivity. So again, having established our research, we consider whether or not we can replicate our findings. And that's one of the hallmarks of science is to be able to replicate. So we know that a finding is true. We know that a theory is relevant when we can replicate a study and we get the same outcomes. And so we know that there's a relationship between poverty and violence because a number of researchers have studied that relationship and they have consistently found the same outcomes, that there is a relationship between those two variables. And so it is through replication that we are able to be confident in our scientific findings, because the research process is all about replicating what's already been done in a slightly different way to see if we get similar outcomes or data points. So sociologists often study the society in at least 3 different ways. Positivist sociology is a way of looking at society, studying society based on scientific observations. It's rooted more in the scientific approach. Positivists believe that there is an objective world that's out there that we can study. And by out there, meaning that there's an objective world that can be experienced with our senses, is how positivists see the world. They believe that if you can feel it, you can touch it, you can see it, you can smell it, you can study it, that it is real, it exists out there. And so by out there, meaning that the society is a laboratory for social scientists to study. And so we can go out and we can study crime, we can study poverty, we can study homelessness, we can study different sort of groups and the dynamics within those groups, because those entities exist tangibly in the world that we can see, touch, and experience with our senses. And so the positivists see the world in that way. They approach the world as being objective, it being an objective reality that we can examine. And so their job then is to gather empirical evidence on the facts so that they can verify those things in the real world. So we believe that it's snowing outside. And so we go and take a look. And if in fact we see snow, then we can confirm that it exists. And so positivists see that the fact that there is something out there that we can study, we can see it, we can taste it, and we can do all those things, we can measure it, we can assess it, we can observe it. Another type of way of doing sociology is interpretive sociology. Interpretive sociology focuses on the meaning that people attach to their social world. And so interpretive sociologists are less inclined to say that there's a world that's out there. These individuals rely heavily on the idea of objectivity, but their focus is on the meaning that we attach, the idea that the physical world is not as important as how people experience the physical world, their understanding of the empirical world. That's more important, they argue, than seeing the world through our five senses. It's about how they understand it. But we could talk about the four ways that interpretive sociologists differ from positivist sociologists. For one, interpretive sociology is carried out in the natural or everyday settings. Another type of sociology is critical sociology. And before I move on to critical sociology, I will go back and find some additional slides for you to identify the four ways in which positive sociologists differ from interpretive sociology, because that's important. With that said, critical sociology is the study of society that focuses on the needs for social change. So critical sociology is about examining the world, identifying its flaws, its weaknesses, and using research to improve those things. And so we talk about inequality. Critical sociologists believe that there is a solution to inequality. We just have to do research and find it. And once we come up with that, we can then repair, improve the society. But it starts with a critical look to identify what the problems are, and then identifying what those solutions might be. And so we talk about violence, for example. Some would say that the problem with violence is that there are too many guns on the street. We would have to do empirical research to find that out. Others say the reason that there's violence is because people are struggling economically, where people don't have jobs, people are not vested in the community, they are more likely to commit violent acts against other members because they are not necessarily vested in that community. And so we use that information to try to improve those communities. And so critical sociologists, it's about being critical of the society and taking that information and using it to fix the society. Is what they are hoping to do, to fix the society. All right. I think this is a good place to stop. I'll end it here, and we can pick up next time. And but I do want to. This will allow us an opportunity to take some questions and to dive a little deeper into any of the ideas, concepts that I have discussed so far. So you enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you later in the week. Thank you.